Welcome back, duelists. I have returned as promised with a tier list discussing the best staples of the format. We break down what's the best main, what's best aside, what's just okay, and then what cards you should be kind of avoiding. For this installment, I have broken up the okay cards into an extra sorted tier of poor staples with some sort of merit, but I would overall rather avoid. If you guys enjoy this type of video, then please let me know by liking and subscribing, as well as commenting down below if you want to see more. And hoping to get one of these out one more time this season before the NAWCQ, and I guess EUWCQ too for my European lads watching this. So let's start off with the hand traps. And I'm going to start us right off the bat with the cards that I have kind of been saying are some of the best in the game right now. The Mulch Charmies. Mulch Charmy, Fubulas, Meowls, and Perulia. I have kind of been talking about main decking all three of these. However, that's a luxury that most decks don't have. Why would you main deck three of these? Well, I feel like trying to combat Malice from the approach of stopping their field with hand traps feels almost impossible. However, Malice boards have gotten a bit weaker with them cutting some of the more power-based cards, instead going for consistency and a more measured control approach, which doesn't make things much easier, but it means that the tempo hand traps aren't as important per se. Furthermore, the rise of Mitsu makes some of them, specifically Meowls, a lot worse. And again, the problem with Mulch Armies as they're dead going second is most decks can't afford to main online. So because of that, they're not all going to be the same tier here. I do think that Fubulas is a main deck staple, and in my eyes, it is probably the best card to draw in the game, one of the most important cards to draw in the game. Obviously, drawing it going first feels bad, but you can still navigate game states where you can use this going first. For example, say you open up an awkward hand in a Mitsurugi. You can have a prayer set with a Ame, use prayers to tribute the Ame, don't revive, you just search, and then new chain Ame effects revive, chain Fua, nuke the fields, now they're reset, and the Fua is resolved. Alternatively, in Malice, you can do the same sort of thing, where you go your Malice Red Ransom to add Malice in the Mirror. And from that point, you can set the Malice in the Mirror, negate a card affecting your opponent's turn, banishing the Red Ransom, and then a new chain Red Ransom would activate, and you can chain Fubulas. Now, for Perulia and Meowls, which you want to use earlier on in the turn to really be effective, it is more convenient, as well as it's not like ideal always to go for this type of play. That being said, it's not completely dead going first. And when you go second, this card feels so strong. And unlike Perulia or Meowls, which aren't always good against some hands or some matchups, Fubulas is pretty much good almost any time you go second. It just feels like one of the most impactful cards to draw. And for me, it's like one of the best staples in the game. And that doesn't mean Perulia and Meowls are bad cards. That just means you want to keep them targeted for specific situations. I still think you want these in some matchups like all 9. And I still think you're putting in Perulia versus every Rizal deck, and that includes Mitsu, and Meowls versus Malice for sure. So that means these end up as side deck best staples for me. And my decks right now do contain between main and side 9 Charmies, unless I really absolutely cannot fit them in for some sort of other reason. Keeping in track with the lingering floodgates in the hand, Draw Lockbird. So Draw Lockbird is a card that was pretty solid last format. Now, in my Suda tier list, I think I had some of the cards that ended up being the best in the format lower on than they should have been, and my opinions changed as the format progressed. By the point of YCS Vegas, right before a new format kind of popped up, and the YCS and myself and my teammates Dominic and Mike won, we all main decked 3 Cross-Out 3 Talents. We decided, and 3 Droll. We decided those were the best cards. That was before the ban list made it so Rizal had to play a shit ton of searchers to even get going. Now Droll versus Rizal is just even stronger, because there's a significantly lower chance they start with Ice Rizal, as well as the Mitsu cards are also really bad into Draw Lockbird. Against Malice, though, it's obviously not brilliant. However, it can still do something. The new Malice deck does draw a lot of cards, and you're also going to be adding off Red Ransom. And then they also have the searches off of the backup, potentially off Wicked. Because of that, Droll does impact them. Now, their end field is still going to be good against Droll, but I think that it is worth playing Droll on the main deck because Mitsu seems to be growing in popularity compared to Malice, and it is just so good against that. It'll randomly catch other decks off guard, and you actually have the application using it first, depending on your deck, to beat Fualos. So while Droll maybe isn't a guaranteed like 100% main deck staple, I think its absolute power in the matchups it's good in, and still being playable in others, means that it is worth a main deck spot. But if you're not putting it on the main, this card needs to be in your side deck. It is better than Lancia was last format. And speaking of, let's talk about Lancia. So while Malice is a better deck now than it once was, and arguably the strongest deck in the format. I know other people will disagree with me and say that Mitsu is. And it's not because Malice got worse, it's because Malice got better in a way that now they have ways to outmaneuver Lancia. It's not brilliant, but just the fact that cards like Backup and Wizard exist, and search cards like AI Michu exist, means that when you lance them going first, they pivot into half fields like that red ransom board I was talking about. And honestly, those fields aren't bad, especially backed up with a hand trip or two, that you still probably lose the Lancia. Now, that being said, when you go first and open Lancia, it is a death sentence. There is like almost nothing that the Malice deck can do when you have some board follow-up and Lancia. But it's also not the same insane strength that I think it was before. I still would put this in pretty much every side deck, but it's ironic because where I didn't want to play Malice before because Lancia was the turn skip every couple games in everyone's side deck, I think Droll is that for Mitsu, and Lancia is not as much of that for Malice. Oh, maybe it's just hyperbole and frustration for me as a Rizal player, being constantly drolled, that it feels not worth it. I'm struggling to kind of see too much advantage to pick Rizal over Malice in this kind of position. Still, Lancia, I think, not a main deck card, but for sure, cream of the crop for best side deck staples. Now, one last lingering floodgates hand trap to talk about, everyone's favorites, and thankfully limited, Dimension Shifter. So, D-Shifter, I would normally put in the best main deck staple. In fact, I have to check the tier list like history on the channel for when the last time it wasn't there. But ironically, I think it should not be in your main deck in this format. There are too many Malice opponents that Shifter just does nothing against, that I would not want to main it. Even against Rizal, while it's good, it's pretty good versus Rizal. I was about to say, it's not game ending. It's really strong though. That being said, I would not main deck it just because the amount of Malice that exists. It's such a dead card in that matchup. Now, obviously, it's just the one of, but when you draw it, your opponent will be mad. And if I'm your opponent, you better watch out. But with that, let's move on to some of the more standard hand traps. So let's start off with the Dominus cards. Another newer set of cards which are pretty sick. Now, in the last tier list when Rizal was king, the best Dominus card was Purge. And if you could main deck that card, you should main deck that card. And Impulse was kind of lackluster. This was kind of evident as the dominant force in the meta was Rizal. So you built your deck to beat Rizal. In this case, with Malice being, in my opinion, the driving force in the meta that everyone kind of builds around, Impulse is the better card. Impulse is also very good versus Mitsu, so that does help. The only thing that's really bad against are the inherent summons and exceed summons that is Rizal. And it's not unplayable in that matchup either, so it's not the end of the world. Obviously, you can snipe Eclipse Twins and grind games, and that's huge. Or even Ices and Nodes, it's not that big of a deal. Purge, on the other hand, I feel like is worse. It's not a dead card versus Malice, but ultimately, it's a pretty low power hand trap where, honestly, it could end up being worse than Valor in some cases. Not interacting with cards like Dormouse, Mouse and Underground, Whitebinder, it's kind of rough. Versus Mitsu, I mean, it's like Ash, which is solid, so hitting cards like Purge can be nice, or if they have a card on the field, hitting an Ame Engrave can be good. However, it never really does enough for me to be truly satisfied with it, so it's just an okay card, and this is going to be my first inclusion in the solid main deck staple section. Continuing on the trend with somewhat normal hand traps, where does Infinite Impermanence go? So Imperm is a card that, if you've seen me talk on stream, I think kind of sucks right now. I think versus Mitsurugi, Rizal, it just does nothing. You can't hit Saji when it's tributed off Habakiri. If you hit Duo Drive, they still get crossed because of Star. If you play versus Malice, they either have Lingribo for anything important, but that most of the time there is nothing important because Malice plays through Imperm like it's nothing. So Imperm feels like a somewhat versatile board breaker where you can snipe single target cards that matter, like Bomber Dragon or Detonator, and then occasionally you pair it with other hand traps to be impactful. But in reality, most games, Imperm feels rough to me, and even drawing 2 Imperms doesn't feel that good, where before double Imperm would have felt rather solid. Imperm, however, is still better than the other Effect Nation hand traps because it has the flexibility of being used going first. And even though Callby and Talents are both L1, being a trap and not a monster is still a nice upside. So for me, this is a solid main deck staple, but it's one that truthfully teeters on the lower end for me. I don't think this card is as good as the stats may kind of conclude. I think it gets included in decks almost as a sort of habit. And if I'm building a hand trap lineup for an event, I would rather choose so many other cards that I really don't know if Imperm would make the cut. But that brings us to the next card, and that is Effect Veiler. Effect Veiler is just the same thing in most cases, but a bit worse. And if I'm already not feeling that good about Imperm, then Veiler is the same. And I really would find it hard to believe you find yourself needing 6 copies of Imperm in a deck, because again, drawing multiples doesn't even really feel that good in most game states. Now that being said, Valor, when paired with stuff other than another Valor, can be solid, and in very, very simplified game states, it is still just a good card. However, there are many game states where this card does very little, and unless you really need a lot of hand traps, I'd be avoiding Valor. And then lastly, in terms of effect negation, we've got our first Ghost Sister, and that is Ghost Mourner and Moonlit Chill. And this is like the common trio. It's Impermanent, Valor, then Mourner, all decreasing in strength as we go along. Yes, there are some formats where Mourner is the best card or the better one. This is not one of them. It is taking the bad attributes of Valor and Imperm and then making them worse as we progress to the point where this should not be in your deck. I'd be very, very hard pressed to find a good reason for you to want to include Mourner. And with one Ghost Sister out of the way, let's talk about the others. And that brings us to everyone's favorites, Ash Blossom. Ash Blossom is a fairly strong card right now. It has some very solid applications. Like always, Ash being as versatile as it is what makes it a pretty good staple. Now sometimes, even though it's versatile, it's not good enough to end up being a top dog. I do think that is the case in this format. You can use it against Mitsu and Ryzel, obviously to try cut off Engine. You can break apart combos if they start with just Mitsu or Ryzel cards, or you can play against Malice. And hitting MTP is pretty good because that stops a March Hare access sometimes to keep them ending on a weaker field. And also importantly, they stop mulch armies because that is a huge part of this metagame, as I said. And I think given the states of mulch armies, Ash takes on the same role it does here as in Master Duel. So it's good in several different cases, and it excels in stopping a card you really care about. So I do think it does fall into one of the best main deck staples. Next up, we got Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit. This one always fluctuates, really volatile. It's either like great or piss poor. It's piss poor now. Before, this card was solid because it would stop Duo Drive, and then it stopped Search too. The fact that it's usually isolated or insulated by an Ame no Murakamo means you're discarding 2 cards alongside it, as well as if they're playing Star Ryzel, you can use Cross on you. With Cross there, Ogre just does nothing. And Ogre obviously versus Malice, it never connects to anything meaningful. They float way too well. Versus Mitsu, they have the destruction protection if they even cared, but again, it floats extremely well, and they're on summon effects that don't get negated by Ogre. So in this format, Ogre for me is just a very clear big loser. It should not be in your deck. The same goes for one that has been at the bottom of these lists for pretty much ever, Ghost Reaper and Winter Cherries. Now, I always see people talk about this card, and myself, I did play it because I was desperate when I played my budget Blue Eyes deck as an out to Detonator. The way the format's progressed, and with Mitsu Ryzel being so much more popular than pure Ryzel, the problem with that is you probably still end up losing to now the Cross plus Duo Drive and follow-up and Mitsu cards portion of the deck. That makes the Cherry almost worthless. Versus Malice, they can recycle it as well. So Cherries really doesn't have a spot in the format. It should not be given the time of day. You just go next. Lastly, there's Ghost Bell Haunted Mansion, a card that, again, it's pretty volatile depending on the format. Either it's just sitting at the bottom, unplayable, or it's pretty solid. And I think right now, the stonks for Bell have risen. For me, it is a solid main deck staple. Now, the reason is it actually has applications in both the main matchups, the Mitsu, Ryzel, and Malice one. Versus the Malice deck, obviously you can hit Banishes from the Grave like March Hare, you can hit White Binder, you can hit the Revive effects of GWC, and this is important for stopping Bomber for triggering, some disruption from being established in your turn, or stopping from comboing. The fact that it can be used kind of dual purposed as both extension and prevention is what gives it a really good application. Now, what I don't like with Bell against Mitsu is that prayers can still revive the Ame, and if you Bell the prayers, then Ame revives. But I do think that Bell is still a good card in a lot of the spots, and in scrappy game states, the negate is nice. So it is a solid main deck staple for me. Speaking of Graveyard Disruption, I do think it is time to talk about Bestials. At the start of the format, I would have said they're bad. I don't like them. And my opinion on that has changed. And this maybe is a little bit different because I'm thinking more from a Malice-centric position here. For one, Fiendsmith seems to have not fallen off as hard as I may have expected, with Shooping still getting second. Bestials still are applicable versus the 2 main threats. Obviously, versus Ryzel, it can be good against hitting Detonator and Twins, but versus the Ryzel cards, there's a lot of 1-ups, right? So if you snipe their Ame and it's gone, it's gone. Now, okay, I guess Kusanagi brings it back, but resolving that is incredibly slow and doesn't give them the opportunity to actually disrupt you with the Ame, which is all you actually care about. It's gone for the turn and developing you a body in the process. Now, versus Malice, you'd also argue this card is just unplayable, but in truth, you can get away with this a decent bit because what the Bestials do is a couple things. For one, you can trigger Bomber on your own accord. which in some cases can be useful. In other cases, you banish cards from the grave that already triggered. That way they can't bring them back off of March Hare. And if people aren't playing GWC, that means they can't actually retrieve it that well. And it makes the positions a lot more awkward for them. Now, the other time this comes up is versus the revival effects in the deck. Splash Mage, target a name that's already been used or a non-mouse name for whatever reason, and Bishop to stop it. And then obviously being big bodies, they do provide you some sort of utility for pushing Link second as extension, assuming your deck either has links or some way of utilizing the bodies. So with that said, where do they rank? Well, Magnamut, I think, is one of the best main staples because when Bishops have merit, Magnamut's just broken. It's just one of the best cards ever printed. Judas Worm is a solid main staple. It is still very good and it has power behind it. And then I think a solid side card is Baldric if you need more Bistrels. I think any more Bistrels besides those two in the main deck really don't make sense as they do become worse going second cards, extenders into other matchups, and that's a bit concerning. But in some matchups where you want more Bistrels, which I think will exist, then you put in cards like Baldric and Saronir, and you get the job done. Those cards aren't the only graveyard disruption hand traps. We've also got Allied Justice Cycle Reader, a card which was popular in the sort of in-between format between the ban list and Aelin. Now, I would never suggest main decking this because the best two decks in the format have very few lights. It's really just the Rizal cards. But you can argue with this card in the side deck because there is still no doubt that its efficacy versus both Blue Eyes and Fiendsmith is still there. And hitting two cards versus one does make it more impactful than, say, Abyssal does. Hitting like the Requiem and the Lacrimour, the Requiem and the Engraver is actually a huge deal. Unfortunately, Cycle Reader plays in a Necroquip Princess, so it's a bit worse in some regards. So I do think this card is a solid side deck option. That being said, if you don't need anything in your side deck for Blue Eyes or Fiendsmith, don't play this card. It should really only be here if you decide you need cards for those matchups. And you're like, okay, I need something there. Then Cycle Reader hits the bell. There we go. Similarly, we got DD Crow, a card which Shuping played in his second place ICS deck list. I don't get this one. I mean, like, it fills some of the roles that the Bistral does and has a little more flexibility in hitting other cards and other matchups, but for the most part it does the similar role to Bistral, but without the free body, which is huge, or the extra bonus effect that Bistrals also grant. The upside is that if you're playing a Rizal deck, you aren't clogging your field with a non-level 4. There are some times when the Crow can come in clutch, and for Mitsu, that is the case, but for the most part, this is a pretty low quality hand trap that is not that flexible. It's a poor staple. It has some merit, but I do not get behind playing this card. And the last graveyard disruption card I got is Skullmeister. This card has been a terrible card on all my tier lists. It stays there. Continuing on with the hand traps, we've got Gnome Material. Gnome Material is always speculated as a fun card to hand trap people with. It needs very, very specific formats to be playable. This is not one of them. Next up, we got Vados. Pop field spell, summon yourself the opponent's field, and if it gets linked off or sent off, it nukes everything. That is cool. However, field spells really aren't the name of the game right now. Some people are checking it in a Vanquish Soul meta next format, so we'll stay tuned to see if it finally gets out of the shitter section, but for now, it is still in the avoid these category. Next up, we got Chaos Hunter, a somewhat popular one as a Malice counter. However, with the advent of Topological Bomber Dragon as a solid end piece, it also means that Chaos Hunter feels rather hard to pull off in the Yu-Gi-Oh right now, because discard a card to summon it just to die to a bomber feels really bad. So I would not be playing Chaos Hunter right now. I think it has a specific job, which is Malice, and it can't even do that reliably. So let's just kick it to the curb and rely on a different strategy. Next up, we got Retaliating Sea and Context. Let's talk about both these together. Neither of these have a good target. Retaliating Sea on Mitsu is not important enough because, well, Ame pops it. Mitsu cards do trigger when they're banished, and it's the only spell that can summon from the deck or from anywhere, so cards are terrible. Contact C stops XYZs, but Rizal can just send it off with Ice and Node, so it sucks. Versus Link decks, this card is nothing, so yeah, unplayable. Next, we got Cyframe Gear Gamma and Delta and the Sword. Now, you could argue just playing Gamma and Driver is a Hail Mary versus Malice going second, and honestly, I don't hate it. Delta, on the other hand, is actually not bad versus Rizal because there are more spells with prayers and ritual, but it's still not great. And versus Malice is pretty poor. You probably should avoid these cards, and on my tier list on screen, I have them in the avoid section. But maybe, just maybe, if your deck can use cards in hand, one Gamma, one Driver in the side deck. But yeah, not brilliant cards. And then we've got Phantasme. Phantasme is one which I do not particularly like. However, I see the merit behind it, and that is if you're able to engage in a slow, grindy Malice game, then Phantasme is great because every time they summon a Malice monster, Phantasme comes down. Once you fix your hand, which is great, and it's a body that you can use to stuff. You also trigger Bomber on your own terms as well, so if you want to get rid of a Cryptor in the board. Importantly as well, you can use them both players' turns because they should be summoning them twice, which means if you draw 2 Phantasmes, you oftentimes keep both. It's the same for Fiendsmith, right? Hitting cards like Requiem on both players' turns feels great, but like, when you think about this could have been a more targeted card for the matchup in its place, you're like, all right, maybe this shouldn't have been in here. So it's a poor minimal merit staple for me that I'm throwing in the bottom end of the spectrum. Lastly, that brings us to one more hand trap, one you guys have probably been screaming, where is it? Where is Nibiru? Here's Nibiru. So Nibiru is one that is, at the start of the format, I would have said it's just okay. It's not great. However, the more I've seen players talk about it and play it, I'm kind of sold on it being one of the better hand traps. One, when you're relying on other hand traps like Purge, Bistrils, then Nib does get pretty good. So Nib by itself probably won't get there in most game states. Some players it can, especially if they make mistakes, or some awkward hand it can. But in most cases, Nib is not enough by itself. But given that most decks these days are constructed with like 15 plus non-engine and hand traps, Nib is pretty good when paired. Significantly more so than Imperm is. On top of that, like usual, Nib is just one of the best cards to open when you go first. So if you make a decent field backed up with Nibiru, you got Drolls, and you have like Interrupted 2, then Nib should get the job done, because it's essentially the same thing as pairing it with something else. Those are all the hand traps. There's sure a lot of them, and I feel like every time I do this list, there's another hand trap to add. Oh man. Now let's move on to the breakers. So first up, I want to talk about a card fresh out of Alliance Insights, and that is Gordian Slicer. A card I talked about on the Tier 0 Games channel a little bit, and is a card I thought you should pick up. Now, that's not necessarily because I thought it was good this format. I think it is a good card, and it can be good. But right now, I'm unsure. Given we don't exactly know how Mal's end fields can go just yet, and we're still a bit of uncertainty in how people will end their turn, it's not great. It's not great in the Detonator because it can still pop itself in Twins Revive. For Mitsu cards, it's not really great either. I think this card does have potential in the future, and even right now, like, you can get away with some nasty stuff. If people are ending on Cryptor plus Bomber, right? That's actually pretty good to bounce back those 2 cards. It's actually pretty nasty. If they're ending on, I guess, Ame Detonator, you can target the Ame and that forces them to prayers. Maybe this card's better than I thought. The weird thing with breakers is always, in the beginning of a format, they're worse than they end up being later on. When boards get more predictable, as people find optimized combos and spreadsheets, you can plan against what to beat and play breakers that target it. And Gordian Slicer, if that's what everyone is ending on and nothing else, might actually be good enough. It would require the format to develop a little more and then take some careful analysis. It is a bit risky, right? Because if they know it's in your deck or people are playing something a bit different, then it ends up being a little meh. And then there will be some formats where this card is just good anyways. So I think this card is an okay choice. I don't love it. So for me, it's a poor staple. It has merit, it has potential, and you can definitely have the right tournament for this card to be in your deck. But for now, it's kind of just an okay-ish option. In a similar vein, we got Ultimate Slayer. So Ultimate Slayer is a card I do have rated a little bit higher. It serves a very similar role where you're clearing 2 monsters in one, and versus the Bomber Cryptor field, it does the same thing, but it has better applications versus Ryzel, which is important because you get a Detonator. And depending on your deck, you also get advantage out of it too, because if you're playing a Ryzel deck, you get to send an XYZ, and that's pretty cool. Now, a tech we've talked about a little bit before is you can send Borrowcode Dragon off Ultimate Slayer. Borrowcode is a link that in the grave can banish yourself to banish a 3k attack monster, Dark, on the field, either player's field, so your opponent's Ame or their Bomber or a Code Talker, and then summon from your extra deck a Top Logic Zeraboros or Bomber Dragon. You don't always need to summon the monster, that's not super important, but the biggest part here is, again, it just deals with multiple threats at once. It's high value. I think it's ultimately a little better than Gordian Slicer because its cost on deck building is less, as well as in general, it's going to be more versatile, even though it's not always better. Both cards to keep an eye out for, but right now, Slayer is a solid side card. I think it's better than Slicer, but it's not anything brilliant. And that brings us to our newly limited Triple Tactics Talent. A card which you were tilted before when it happened, but now you get even more tilted because it's out one. And I know myself, I was at Regional, and I drolled my opponents. They got cross out Talents, and I'm like, man, it's rough. Talents, I think, is actually a little worse than it was before. So when you're playing a lot more of the one-for-one hand traps, like Valor, Imperm, and whatnot, when you get hand trapped in your turn, Talents look at their hand ends up being brutal. Because if you see too many hand traps, you hit one of their starter cards, and if they have a second one, you Valor it. If they have only one other hand trap, you hit the hand trap and you combo. So Talents felt really good. However, when you're playing less of those cards. For one, you can't defend yourself on the multiple engine cards, but also if they Fool Loss you or poorly in the draw phase, you can't use talents. Even if they do and you hit a hand trap, you can't really combo. Droll as well. You have to still stop. You're forced to just trade 1 for 1 for an engine. And that's all the card does. It's still great, but it's not as broken. It's not a necessity. And then as well, going second stealing a monster is fantastic in a lot of cases, but for Ryzel's case, it is worse. It was better in a Ryzel mirror format, but when not every format is a Ryzel mirror, you have to debate if it is still worth main decking. I think it is a solid main deck staple because it has enough applications that are pretty nuts, but it's not as broken as I thought it was before. That being said, this card always ends up being better as of late as format progresses. So yeah, solid main deck staple for now, but we'll see how that changes. Next up, in terms of breakers, I want to talk about Metal Tronus. Metal Tronus is a weird one because obviously it doesn't always act as a breaker. I think its main intended use is as a breaker. You just have the luxury of also using going first if you are playing it. Now, this card's biggest problem is like always that it can get ashed, but for the most part, this is really good at dealing with the threat it's intended to deal with. You can deal with Malice cards, obviously, which is not bad because you can cut off some of the grind game, even if the cost is some of your own, and finagle around what your opponent has going for them. It also gives the option of dealing with Detonator, which is still one of the strongest cards in the game. Its overall versatility is not to be underestimated. I think this card is pretty solid. Next, I'm going to talk about the back row removal breakers, Lightning Storm and Feather Duster. So I think these cards have some merit, specifically as side deck options, because when you're trying to piece together options to break half fields, they're pretty solid because they can force out cards of GWC, they can hit other back row MTP, but not always because they can search them mid-turn off White Rabbit, which is kind of a problem. But they can also be used against, say, Ryzel to hit Cross, as well as, of course, Prayers, which is actually pretty strong. And you can also hit the Spare Imperms, and Strike is somewhat popular as well. So being able to Duster and Lightning Storm is not bad. That being said, unless your deck is a high engine count deck that really wants to be breaking fields, I'm not like sure this is really where you want to be. If you need more cards for other matchups as well, like back removal, like Blue Eyes, then I guess this can come in as well because you have some dual purpose. But yeah, these aren't like highlights of the format right now. In a similar vein, we've got Evenly Matched, a card that I truly despise. With no real negation right now besides A-Code, a card that not even everybody ends on, you can get away with just evening people. And it won't win you the game just yet because they still can do other stuff alongside it and have plays afterwards. But you force out some disruption, you force them to lose some resources, and it definitely can be a favorable outcome. Versus Ryzel, for example, they have to just burn their prayers at the cost of your battle phase for what it's worth, so you will have to engage in a grind game. And that's not always the worst thing versus these decks, is because of the hits and the nature of the optimizations. Sometimes you can actually do that, but it's still not brilliant. You need to be very prepared for the game plan and be building around it. So again, Lightning Storm and Duster, it's just a poor staple, but it has some merit, so it's not complete dog shit. Next up, with breakers, we got Forbidden Droplets, a card which I truthfully think is pretty bad right now. I don't like Effect Negation in a lot of cases. You can snipe specific interactions that hurt you and dodge some on-field effects like dodging a Cryptor by putting a guy in grave. And importantly, it is a decentish answer to Detonator. So Droplet is not a useless card. It has merits, but I think the overall Effect Negation mechanic is poor right now. So for that reason, it's a poor staple. Next up is Exceed Encore, and it's a similar kind of role. It's very specifically going to be used to deal with Detonator. If that's what you're looking to do, then Encore is fine. But otherwise, I feel like you should not be including this in your deck. Poor staple and minimal merit. And that brings us to an end of the sort of conventional breakers that I'd consider playable. The rest of these breakers I'm going to list off, I think are bad. I'll go over the reasons kind of a little bit. I don't want to ramble on forever about cards that I think are bad. Kurikara was one that had a little bit of viability last time because it was good versus Ryzel. You can apply some pressure with it. I really didn't buy into that hocus pocus. As we saw the format progress, it saw like no actual good play. And I think it's even more true now where it's terrible in some matchups. And even versus Ryzel, like, it's not that good. And the Detonator of Twins means it's even less good. It's just avoid Kurikara. Enemy Controller, often a really cool card versus things that target. Not that much to target right now. As well as the steal mechanic ends up being not that good because it's weird how Malice and Ryzel show different decks that stealing cards in other matchups is not that important or not that impactful. And even in the Ryzel mirror, Econ is not great. It seems like it's a type of deck that Econ will be good against, but Detonator is just so overbearing that it's not okay. The steel effects you're going to notice in trend are pretty poor. And I haven't mentioned Change of Heart yet. That's because it's on here as a bad option. So yeah, Change of Heart, Mind Control, Snatch Steal. Another iconic trio of cards that would be stealing your opponent's monsters. I don't see good uses for these. Even stealing cards like Bomber, it's just a small piece of the puzzle, and it's significantly less value than the other breakers that exist in the format. And it's not like you're making anything truly useful out of these cards. So for me, it is simply not worth it. Avoid them. And similarly, Electric Virus, Puppet Plant, Marionette Might, same cards. Don't meet the bill right now, so we toss those aside. Now bringing us back to the Tribute to Summon monsters, Curie card summons your field with the famous Kaijus, Lava Golems, and Sphere modes of the world. There's way too much follow-up in off-field effects with Twins, Prayers, Ame, the Mouse monsters, March Hare, GWC, MTP, that until something changes, these will not be playable for a while. In fact, you can argue that soon these should be phased out of a staples tier list. Next, we've got some big boss monsters that can be used to break fields. First up is Dynamite Wrestler Pankratops. So Pankratops is probably the best out of the monsters I'm about to mention. However, in this format, it doesn't do anything. Your best bet is sniping a back row. It doesn't deal with Detonator. It doesn't deal with anything Malice related. It doesn't deal with the Mitsu card. So what are you actually aiming to do with this? That being said, there will be formats where Pankratops is playable. Like, for example, what OCG trends have shown is that versus Yummy, Pankratops is good into that field, as their effects trigger to tag out on the opponent's turn. They need to bounce themselves back and they're not as cost. So if you chain Pankratops, it deals with it. In those cases, yeah, Pankratops is good, but right now it's not actually doing any specific job that's important, so it's not worth playing. And usually when Pankratops is bad, Alpha Master Beast is also bad. A very similar role, summoning himself for free and acting as removal. The only other time where Alpha might be better is if you specifically need to bounce instead of destroy. Still, it's not going to cut over Detonator, and everything else is still bad against, so Alpha is just very low quality extension. And that takes us to the more traditional OG breakers, Dark Hole and Raigeki. So these cards, love them. But while they were playable in previous formats because you can pair multiple together, it's not the case here. You can delay your response timing to the point where Raigeki and Dark Hole don't do anything by March Herring mid-turn. You have hand traps as well to offset the monsters you lost. The Mitsu cards will revive off of prayers. You need like 3 Raigekis to do anything versus Detonators, so it's not worth it. It's not going to be trading up anytime soon. We got Dark Lunamore, a card which has potential to be fantastic. However, it just never does. It's been weird with the way Yu-Gi-Oh's kind of progressed. Dark Rulers doesn't seem to cut it. Right now, it's even more exacerbated by most decks just not playing that much negation on the field, which I think is mostly a good thing, but it means cards of Dark Ruler are even worse. So for now, Dark Ruler has no rights to be near the top, but a cool card. I love this card. Next up is Cosmic Cyclone. So Cosmic is one of the more mid-level back removal cards that is often played because it's versatile for going first and going second for hitting specific back row pieces that are searched. However, in this day and age, that is too slow. It is not valuable enough, as well as the going first application of setting it. Doesn't matter right now. It would only really hit the Malice Underground, but doing that mid combo truthfully won't be enough. So that means you kind of have to just hope they only have Underground as their play. So not big on this card. I think you should be avoiding it. Herald of the Abyss does not work against Rizal because they chain Detonator, then Twins revive it, so doesn't cut it in that regard. Herald of the Abyss also just bad versus Malice, so this card isn't easy, just throw in the trash. Next up is Soul Release. This one was a cool breaker versus Graveyard follow-up decks. Malice is a banished follow-up deck, so there's nothing. And Mitsu can dodge this pretty easily, so it actually ends up not being very powerful. Next up we got the Book cards, Book of Moon and Book of Eclipse. 2 cards which have been pretty good in recent formats. Book of Moon is something I kind of said wasn't great but playable in the last tier list, and Eclipse saying was, partially because you can force Duo drives resolution through. And you can also use it to still slow down your opponent when you go first, and they were partial answers to Detonator. As again, we've shifted from a Rizal-centric format to a Malice-centric format, with and also a focus on Samitsu with the Rizal cards. Eclipse and Moon are way worse. They don't do anything versus those other 2 decks. It's just the Rizal function. And then even with the Rizal function, forcing Duo through is less important because, 1, there's less cards stopping Duo, but also because you're starring for cross, so it's not as integral as Duo resolves, as well as you can in engine force it through much easier. So Eclipse and Moon don't feel like they're good cards going first, and going second, they're not great either, so I would probably go. Next up is Super Polymerization. So I'm running through all the breakers I think are just unplayable right now. Super Polymerization, I don't like either. I've seen a lot of talk for this card being playable because you hit multiple cards. It feels high value, but again, the ability of these decks to recur off of the field or off the graveyard so easily means that clearing the field has to really be valuable. And Super Poly is just less value than Slayer and Slicer, as well as it's extremely less flexible. Yes, it has the going first utility, and that is cool, but unless you're looking for something with that going first option, it's not flexible enough going second for it to be worthwhile. And that's what you should really be looking for. The Forbidden, Chalice, and Droplets, cool cards in the Cashier formats because it was way more central around one monster that you protect the castle with. I could have seen a world where if Detonator was the sole thing of the format, these were playable, but because there's so much else going on, these are just not going to cut it. And that kind of brings an end, in some cases, to the board breakers. That brings us to some of the going first cards. Now, some of these are obviously mixed with other sorts of staples as well, but a lot of these will be side deck stuff. First up, let's talk about one. It's the last best main deck staple I have. If you haven't already guessed it, it's Caught by the Grave. This card is honestly fantastic because, again, if we're simulating the maxi effect of Fulos, then having an answer to Fulos is important. Unlike a Bestial, which used aggressively into a Malice card does nothing, if you call by a Cryptor, it does actually stop the Cryptor. But as well as it hits important hand traps, you can hit Detonator Twins, importantly, and then similar to Crow or Bestials, you can hit the Ame when they chip for prayers, and that's not bad either. I think the card has enough applications going second that it merits its extreme power going first. So, easy main deck option. That brings us to Crossout Designator, the kind of parallel. This is one that has always been so hard for me to analyze because I really don't like this card. Not even just from a game perspective. Obviously, it's very frustrating when it's used against you, but also I really hate building my deck with one-ofs all around it. Maybe you have to play this card. For me, it's a poor option right now because I don't like playing it. However, we play it in Master in most decks because you want to play Maxi and you want to stop Maxi. So maybe if you're that weak to draw Lancia and Fua, you have to just play this card. Fitting the one-ofs in a higher ceiling format like this feels so rough to me. Like, I don't really want to put card like Veiler in my deck, and I know it's going to be frustrating when I draw Cross out and I get Veilered. And as well, unless there's enough mirror matches, it doesn't feel great going first either. That being said, I think it being limited actually is a huge hit to the card. It makes it way more of a burden to play this card because the deck building concessions you make are more meaningful for less payoff. Next, I want to talk about the Cashier cards. The Cashier cards are always talked about as viable going first engines, and they can also be used going second. So I didn't talk about Fenrir, but Fenrir often falls in the same category as Pankratops. Now, I'm not really sure how I feel about Fenrir going first, but Unicorn does seem pretty solid. With the limiting of Detonator, Unicorn is actually pretty effective versus both decks. That being said, it's still not great versus Mitsu. What is good versus Mitsu, though, is Birth. And then it can offset some of the lingering Floodgates effects by giving you some still defensive options and bodies and fields to link away with. So I actually think Unicorn is pretty solid. Fenrir is similar, though. It's not much worse. The Fenrir Banish is not bad. It's still removal, which is pretty good. It replaced itself, so it can be good in a grind game if you're able to force it with your own hand traps, and it can be link fodder as well. It's a solid side deck card, but it's definitely not game breaking. Next up for the mirror match cards. We only really got two here. We got Lullaby of Obedience. The Lullaby is an interesting one. I actually think it's not bad in the Rizal mirror because obviously you get to take Rizal cards. However, it's not great into draw, and it's also not good into the Charmies. And everyone's playing Lingering Floodgates right now. You don't want to try extend into it. That's essentially what Lullaby aims to do. So because of that, for me, like, while it has its merits, probably not worth playing. And then Made to Order Mermaid Outfitter is the last one. This is a very cool card. I still believe we'll have it stay. But for now, it's just not going to do it. And that brings us to some Floodgates and Trap cards. These are always the doozies. Truthfully, I only have one card in this list I think is actually really good. And that is one of the best side deck staples. There can be only one. A card I don't think was talked about enough, but I liked this a lot because when you engage in like a grind game versus Malice, they only end on a couple disruptions. You can go second with this card and still win. And obviously going first, Malice has effectively like no outs, especially if they're not preparing for it. So I think there can be only one, and decks that can play. It's actually pretty nasty. It's not great versus Rizal Mitsu, but it's obviously not unplayable either. Because of that, though, I wouldn't main deck it. It's just a side deck option, but I do think it's great in that position. If you catch other decks like Blue Eyes off guard, then cool. That's also sick. In terms of other raw Floodgates, I think Soul Drain is a viable option. Soul Drain obviously being valuable against Malice because it hits a lot of different cards. It's not really going to pop off going second, and Malice isn't the best equipped to deal with these floodgates right now. Versus Mitsu, I probably wouldn't play versus Rizal cards, but if it's pure Mitsu, then you can definitely get away with this because it just stops them altogether. Maybe it's good enough that versus Mitsu, Rizal, you just play this because it also stops X. I'd want to test it to see though, but the card definitely has enough viability across the board. I think Soul Drain is worth looking at right now. Another solid side card is Anti-Spell Fragrance. I do think that the Rizal deck has a fair bit of spells with cards like Seventh Tachyon, Bonfire, Cross, which you can get from the deck, but the Mitsu cards as well. Puts them on Rizal cards. But beyond that, they also have to hard draw the Rizal cards. That's hard. Versus Malice, I'm not thrilled about it because there's enough ways for them to play without needing spells. It's probably not the ideal card in that matchup, but there are other matchups that in Rogue ones, or Memento, for example, where Anti-Spell can still be brilliant. So I think the card is actually a solid side card right now. You're going to map out your side deck with a couple one-of floodgates to be the wretch of your locals. And then as for one last floodgate in the poor staple section, is something that I think is just okay but has some merit. It's Skill Drain. Skill Drain, it feels like it shouldn't be this low. However, Skill Drain is weird because decks can make huge monsters very easy right now. So you can't rely on big beat sticks to win the game. You need to be able to play under Skill Drain to a fair degree. And the reality is Mitsu, Rizal, and Malice can kind of do this, right? Because Prayers lets you tribute to dodge stuff, huge bodies, and you can sack off stuff as well as cost, so you can get things to resolve. Versus Malice, obviously banishing for cost, because you use Cryptor and such to dodge really easily. Also, X Rizal beats this. For Rizal, yeah, Skill Drain's broken, but it's probably on the lower end of the broken floodgates right now. As for floodgates, I think aren't worth playing, the traditional floodgates at least. Deck Lockdown, it's not good enough versus Rizal, I think. You can solo games with it, but I don't love how it locks yourself out. And then also versus Malice, unplayable, because Underground, White Rabbit, and Gold Mouse just go right past it. Goes in match. There is some diversity in attributes, but not enough diversity in attributes for this to be worth the cut. So we will be dropping our Gozen. The same goes for Rivalry. While there is diversity among Mitsu cards, I think that they can still kind of avoid this enough with the way like Ice works and Detonator that I wouldn't love this against Mitsu. And then versus Malice, obviously this card is just unplayable. So yeah. And then lastly, D-Fissure. D-Fissure is like not the worst technically. I mean, it's bad versus Malice, but versus Rizal cards and Macrocosmos is the same thing. It's both those together. I guess going first, they're fine, but it doesn't stop them altogether. And like, if your board is weak, you can still get your shit rocks by an Amen or a combo. And if you let them get to an Exciton as well, or Tornado Dragons are playing it, it still can be a problem for you. So it's not going to carry games by itself to the degree you want your floodgates to. Next up, let's talk about some of the lingering floodgates. Gravekeeper Inscription, I think, is a solid side card that is not given enough credit. I think, ironically, it's still good versus Malice if people not ending on their A-code field. But if people are ending on Bomb or Cryptor, then you make it so not to pick a banish from the grave until the end of the next turn, and now they can't tear, and they're going to have very little follow-up. They're going to have the one Bomber and the Cryptor. So if you just have a monster to summon into the Bomber zone, you force the Cryptor out, and then they should have like nothing left. You clear the field, and because Inscription plays on to the next turn, their follow-up is going to be terrible. So you can actually break through fields pretty easily. You also have applications with other decks as well. I wouldn't say the negating Give Rid effect is good enough versus decks like Rizal or Mitsu to warrant putting those matchups, but I think if you predictably kind of know what you're going up against Malice, then Inscription is solid. Still, Inscription is good when you pair it alongside other stuff that isn't a breaker because you can keep them off of the A-code. So I do think this card is like really solid. It's a sided card, but it's not going to be brilliant. There might be better options, but I do like this card. Next up, we got D-Barrier. D-Barrier is a card I considered putting higher on this list. I think it's a solid side card right now. I think people are giving a lot of love to the Solemns at the moment, but as we're transitioning into a little less value-based gameplay, a little more tempo-based, I think we should be swinging back towards in favor of Barrier. Barrier obviously isn't great versus, or unplayable versus Malice. And versus Rizal Mitsu, you have to choose between Mitsu or Rizal what you hit, but I think it's fine. It's actually pretty meaningful to cut off either one of those. I think Barrier is still pretty solid, and truthfully, it scares me as a Rizal player to go up against it. Similarly, we got Different Dimension Ground as another solid option. Again, it's just filling all the upside of cards like Shifter and Fissure with minimal risk. This is mostly just a thrust target, but it's a solid one to have. And similarly, as a thrust target, we got Mischief of the Gnomes. So if you're not familiar with this card, it's a card that's been talked about a little bit over the last few months. But yet to really see the highest echelon of play. What it does is when you activate it, the rest of the turn, your opponent's monsters in their hand have their level reduced by 1. This is good versus Rise, obviously, because it makes the monsters level 3. You can maneuver around it ish by summoning one from the deck off ice and one from the grave off of node, but it is out of their way and it's not necessarily easy to accomplish. Furthermore, this also hits the Mitsu part of the deck because it makes their guys in hand 3s or 7s. The card ends up being pretty cool. There is some flexibility around it, but it hits both engines better than Barrier, and it's something I'm gonna keep my eye on, but is a solid side card still. And then Sanctum, this is obviously worse than Lancia because it's only going first card, but I talked about how Lancia was still kind of nuts going first, so having this as a thrust target is pretty good. And that brings us to Thrust. Thrust, a card I think is solid right now. I almost want to put it in one of the better side deck staples, but I see not enough people playing it, that maybe I could be wrong. And if your hand is all non-engine anyways, you can Thrust for follow-up. So I actually think that this card is pretty solid and can maybe push up higher if the format changes. And the last Lingering Floodgate I want to go over is a card that I actually think is really strong going first if you're not going for Thrust. If you want to beat the Rizal Mitsu deck, and that is Mistaken Arrest. So it's not great versus Malice, but what it does, it's a quick play spell that says until the end of your next turn, either player can add cards from the deck to the hand by drawing. It's just Mistake, but it's a Lingering Flood, so they're not going to be able to answer it. But yeah, this stops Rizal and Mitsu cards. It's a solid side card, and we have a plethora of good side deck options for going first, but it's another one I think is worth considering that is rather solid. And that is the end of the Lingering Floodgate section of this. Let's wrap this up with some of the best traps. So I don't think any of the actual like normal traps stick out as best side deck staples. Again, I kind of said the Solemns were worse than I put last format at, and I think they're kind of ready to be phased out, but they're still solid overall, especially with cards like Bell, Impulse, Droll, maybe your deck, Nib, and you can definitely win many games going first in the backs of these cards. So Judgment and Strike are solid side staples, and their overall versatility means you don't have to commit that many side deck spots to hit everything. And then I have two more trap cards that are common appearances in decks, at least my deck lists, that I think are worth avoiding at the moment. First up is Daruma Cannon. It's just not good enough in a lot of matchups. Versus Malice going first, it can be good enough. But even then, sometimes if you like Daruma the first card they play, if they March Hare, you kind of get shit on. And then versus Mitsu, obviously unplayable. Versus Rizal, it's like fine. But overall, Daruma Cannon is just not where you want to be in terms of power level, so we're going to scrap it. And then lastly, Blackout Laughs, a card I've always thought was super cool. I think it's solid against Rizal as an option to hit something they want to summon on their turn. Then on your turn, you banish it and call it Detonator. However, pretty much every other matchup feels pretty poor against. The trade's 1-for-1. Whereas versus Malice, it's like not unplayable, but again, it doesn't do enough for me to want this to be my specialized going first tech card. So while this card is a cool card and I think will be good in future formats, unless you're playing White Force and really utilizing this as a going second card, it's probably not worth playing. And guys, that's it. There's other niche staples that I for sure missed. If there's any big ones that are relevant in this format or big in recent ones that we wanted to analyze how they've kind of changed, then let me know in the comments below. But that being said, this is kind of how I feel with the format. This is the perspective I have as we head into the final regional season of the year. There is going to be the Battle Legends set coming out within just under a month, which will alter some stuff. The Punk cards, Orchestra cards, Dragon Maid cards. Yeah. And then obviously Duelist Advance comes out for RWCQ and NA, and then Europe as well. But that'll be another tier list for another day. So we'll touch on that closer to the time. And looking forward to playing some Yu-Gi-Oh!